What if I told you that just 50 feet below the freezing black water of the Bering Sea, something was sitting on the ocean floor that could be worth $350 million? At first, nobody on the crew believed it. They thought the numbers on the sonar screen were a glitch, another false alarm in a season already full of them. But as the scans kept repeating, as the sample started coming up heavier than anyone expected, the mood on that boat changed completely. This is the story of Captain Sadie Voss, her dredge the Widowmaker, and the gold zone that nearly tore her crew apart before it made them rich. Before we go further, if you love gold mining, hidden treasure, and true high-drama stories from the Bering Sea, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because what happens on this boat is unlike anything the fleet has seen in years. Say the words Bering Sea to anyone who has spent a season out there, and you'll get the same reaction. Cold water, brutal currents, and boats that can flip a routine dive into a fight for survival in minutes. Sadie Voss had been running dredges out of Nome for 11 years, long enough to know better than to get excited over a single sonar ping. Her claim that season sat in a stretch of water that had been worked over and over by other crews with nothing much to show for it. Nobody expected the Widowmaker to find anything special there. That was exactly why, when her sonar operator called her over to the screen on only the third day out, she almost didn't bother looking. The image on the monitor showed a return that didn't match anything in that section of seafloor. It wasn't the usual scatter of rock and gravel. It was a tight, dense shape sitting in almost the same spot every time they passed over it. Sadie had her operator run the pass again, then a third time. Each scan came back nearly identical, which in 11 years of dredging, she had almost never seen. A signal that consistent usually meant one of two things: a shipwreck or a layer of packed material completely different from the loose sediment around it. She had the coordinates marked and flagged for a closer look, and just like that, an ordinary season turned into something else entirely. Before anyone touched a shovel or dropped a diver into the water, Sadie did what any careful captain does when a claim starts acting strange. She pulled the old paperwork. Nome has decades of mining records, hand-drawn survey maps, and dredge logs going back to the gold rush era. And a lot of that history sits forgotten in filing cabinets and old harbor offices. Sadie and her first mate spent 2 full days combing through whatever they could get their hands on for that stretch of water. What they found was strange. 2 different crews, decades apart, had worked that exact patch of seafloor, and both had pulled out early, with almost no explanation written down. One log simply read "moved off," not worth the trouble. Nothing more. When she laid the old survey lines next to her new sonar data, the pattern jumped out immediately. The spots those earlier crews had walked away from lined up almost perfectly with the strongest returns on her screen. It was entirely possible that the equipment back then simply wasn't sensitive enough to tell a promising gravel channel from ordinary seafloor junk. If that was true, 2 crews may have dredged within feet of something significant and turned back without ever knowing it. For Sadie, that changed the whole calculation. This wasn't just an unusual signal anymore. It was a spot the sea might have been hiding for the better part of a century. Confidence is one thing. Diving 50 feet into the Bering Sea to check it is another. There's only one way to know what's actually down there, and that's to put a diver in the water and look. The morning of the first real dive, the whole crew was on edge. Suits were checked twice, oxygen lines checked a third time, the suction dredge tested and retested before anyone committed to going down. Sadie made it clear to everyone on deck that if conditions turned even slightly dangerous, the dive would be called off immediately, gold zone or not. No paycheck was worth a diver's life, and she'd seen enough close calls in this business to mean it. The moment her lead diver went under, the visibility dropped to almost nothing. Silt and freezing water swallowed him within a few feet of the surface. Above deck, the boat rocked hard against the swell, while below the current kept dragging him sideways off the marked coordinates. Every word over the comm line was clipped and tense. The whole crew stood around the radio, barely breathing, waiting to hear whether the next update would be just more gravel or something that would change the season. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone on that deck understood how much was riding on the next few minutes. When the diver finally reached the marked spot, The seafloor looked unremarkable at first, just a layer of fine gray sand like everywhere else on the claim. But once the dredge nozzle started clearing that top layer away, the picture changed fast. Underneath was a dense, coarse gravel channel that looked nothing like the loose material around it, packed with dark, heavy material that didn't behave like ordinary rock. The diver bagged a handful of samples and sent them straight to the surface. When the crew ran a quick field test on deck, several eyes went wide. The concentration of heavy material in that gravel was far above anything they'd pulled from that claim before. Geologists who reviewed the early data later explained that channels like this typically form over long stretches of time, in places where moving water naturally concentrates heavy minerals and gold in one confined channel instead of spreading it thin across the seafloor. Sadie's crew tested a handful of nearby points, and nearly everyone came back with the same signature. That consistency mattered. A single lucky sample can be a fluke. The same pattern showing up again and again across multiple spots suggested something much bigger and much more continuous sitting beneath that channel. Still, everyone experienced enough to know better held off on getting too excited. Early signs, however promising, are not proof. The real test came with the first proper dredge run. Sadie kept it small on purpose, working a narrow strip so the crew could study each layer as it came up instead of chewing through material blind. When the pump kicked on and the first mix of gravel and sand hit the sluice, the entire deck went quiet. Everyone crowded around the recovery table, waiting. For a minute or two it looked like nothing unusual, just gray sludge and rock. Then the shine started. Small gold flakes began showing up in the tray, more than anyone expected from a first pass. Then came something bigger, a handful of actual nuggets, heavy enough to feel real in the palm of the hand. The deck erupted. Crew members who'd been half asleep an hour earlier were suddenly wide awake, grinning, slapping each other on the back. Sadie picked up the first nuggets herself and turned them over in her glove before saying anything. She reminded everyone this was still early. One good pass didn't make a season, but she couldn't hide that this was the best material she'd pulled off that claim in years. Instead of celebrating too hard, she ordered new samples taken from several more points nearby that same day. If this channel really extended beyond that first small strip, the size of what they were sitting on could be enormous. That's when the number $350 million first started getting thrown around on the boat and eventually across the fleet. Sadie's geologist consultant fed the sonar returns, the sample assays, and the shape of the gravel channel into a standard reserve estimation model used across the industry to project how much material a formation like this might hold if it extended the way the data suggested. The early output was staggering. If the channel ran consistently through that stretch of seafloor, its estimated value could land somewhere in the hundreds of millions, with $350 million as a headline figure that got repeated fast once word leaked out in Nome. Sadie was blunt with her crew about what that number actually meant. It wasn't a bank deposit. It was a model's best guess based on limited data, the kind of estimate that gets revised, sometimes sharply, as more samples and more drilling come in. She'd seen other claims in Nome get talked up on rumor alone and then quietly disappoint everyone once the real numbers came back. Still, there was no denying the buzz. Other captains started asking questions at the docks. A few old-timers pulled out their own decades-old survey maps of that stretch, wondering if they'd walked away from something too. Sadie made a decision that some captains in her position wouldn't have. She slowed down. Instead of racing to dredge as much as possible while the excitement was high, she sent fresh samples from multiple depths and multiple points around the channel to 3 separate independent labs, each logged carefully with exact location and depth so there'd be no confusion later. She wanted purity readings, mineral composition, and sediment structure from people who had no stake in whether the answer was exciting or not. In an industry full of big talk and bigger disappointments, she wanted this one to hold up to real scrutiny before anyone called it anything close to final. Just as the lab samples were heading out, the Bering Sea reminded everyone exactly why this water has the reputation it does. A storm warning came in fast, and within hours the calm working conditions turned into 6-foot swells slamming the hull. Sadie pulled every diver out of the water immediately. Keeping the dredge steady became a fight in itself. The suction pump kept cutting out under the strain, and the underwater camera feed dissolved into static. On deck, the crew scrambled to lash down loose equipment before the pitching boat could send something expensive over the side. It wasn't just the gold that was suddenly at risk. It was the whole operation and possibly someone's life. With the storm showing no sign of easing, Sadie called the whole crew together below decks for an honest conversation. The safety lead didn't sugarcoat it. Another dive in these conditions could genuinely get somebody killed. The engineer was worried the dredge equipment itself wouldn't survive much more pounding. But her geologist pushed back hard on the idea of abandoning the site entirely, worried that walking away now, the same way those two earlier crews had decades ago, might mean losing the claim's momentum for good. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Every eye in that cabin was on Sadie. She didn't rush the decision. She looked over the sonar printouts, the sample results, the nuggets sitting in a small dish on the table, and finally said that they weren't going to be reckless, but they weren't turning tail either. Not until the science, not the weather, and not the rumors, told her there was nothing left down there. It wasn't a speech built for cameras. It was a captain thinking out loud in front of the people whose safety she was responsible for. The plan that came out of that meeting was simple. Wait for a real break in the weather, then dive in short, tightly monitored windows with doubled safety checks, and pull the plug the second anything looked wrong. Word of a possible major strike doesn't stay contained to one boat for long, and by the time the weather cleared enough to dive again, other operators in Nome were paying close attention. Some analysts who track offshore claims started talking about what a confirmed find like this could mean beyond just Sadie's crew. Renewed interest in stretches of seafloor that had been written off decades ago as low value, and a fresh look from companies that had mostly stuck to land-based mining. None of that mattered much to Sadie in the moment. She had one goal: get back down to that channel, take the samples that would either confirm or kill the $350 million number everyone kept repeating on the docks, and do it without losing anyone in the process. The weeks that followed were slower and far less dramatic than the storm, but in a lot of ways they were the part that actually mattered. Divers went down in short, controlled windows. Every sample got logged with exact coordinates and depth. The independent labs sent back their purity and composition results one at a time, and Sadie compared each new report against the last, looking for consistency rather than hoping for a bigger number. Reserve estimates got adjusted more than once as new data came in, sometimes up, sometimes down, which is exactly how a serious operation is supposed to work. She refused to let anyone on her crew call it a done deal until the numbers earned that on their own. By the end of the season, Sadie had something most captains in Nome only dream about: a channel with a genuinely strong, repeatable signature, gold recovered from multiple points along it, and lab work that backed up what her eyes had seen in that first recovery tray. Whether the final reserve landed near that early $350 million estimate or somewhere else entirely would take another season of careful, unglamorous work to nail down. What she did know for certain was that the stretch of seafloor two other crews had walked away from without explanation had turned out to be worth a much closer look than anyone gave it credit for. Standing on deck, as the season wound down, Sadie looked out over water that had nearly cost her the whole operation more than once that summer. She'd tell you this wasn't really a story about a big number. It was a story about not giving up on a hunch just because the sea made it hard, and about being honest enough to let the lab results, not the excitement on deck, decide what you actually had. If there's one thing 11 years dredging that water taught her, it's that the Bering Sea doesn't hand anything over easily, and it definitely doesn't hand over its secrets all at once. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes gold mining and hidden treasure, subscribe and hit the bell, because next season Sadie Voss is heading back out to chase a lead that could make this one look small.